Thank you all for joining us. We're in panel A3. I had the luxury of being over in panel B2, but just before this, and it was a nice group of 3 papers that all overlapped each other really well. And I think panel A3 is going to go even above that, where we've got certainly the most coherent and focused panel of the day, where we're all talking about a very specialized niche in all of this, the crowdfunding world. And I think we've got 3 papers, at least 2 of them will be really interesting, and then I'll bat clean up at the end. Without any further ado, why don't you take it away, Tobias, who's got our first paper. He's with Simon Kleinert on some crowdfunding backer motivation work.
Perfect, yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, how does it look? Can you see everything? Perfect, okay. Thank you very much, Doug, for giving me the floor. And the kind introduction, as Doug said already, my name is Tobias Bürger. I'm from the University of Wuppertal, and I'm currently a PhD candidate. And I'm co-authoring the study with a colleague and good friend of mine who is currently an assistant professor in Maastricht in the Netherlands. The title of our paper, as you can see, is Crowdfunding Culture and Commercial Ventures, an empirical study on rewards and backer motivation. And what we do is that we want to study motivational differences among backers of commercial cultural projects and reward crowdfunding. And we will do this, or we have done this at the largest German reward crowdfunding platform. Since our study is currently under review, I hope, at least, that I will be able to try to go through the presentation of the paper swiftly in order to still have sufficient time to also outline our current revision strategy. Okay, so first off, about the motivation to conduct this study. Probably most people know that acquiring external financial capital is always a fundamental challenge. And as I've already indicated, crowdfunding is one means to do this. Crowdfunding, since I'm the first in this panel, I thought to give a short definition. Crowdfunding can be described as a practice of entrepreneurial individuals and groups to finance their ventures based on small contributions from many individuals via the internet. There are different types of crowdfunding models based on the compensations funders receive for their monetary contribution. We are particularly interested for the reward type, so we are not looking at the equity or donation crowdfunding forms. Originally, reward crowdfunding was used primarily to finance new businesses and new cultural businesses. And the point that I wanted to make is that it originally started to fund arts and creative businesses before it broadened to other spheres, which for us was the motivation to study, to look at the differences between cultural business and commercial business. So the research question we chose was, what motivates backers to pledge for a commercial and a cultural project? And what we employ is a quantitative analysis, and we do a lot of categorization based on manual coding. Since the time is quite tight, you can see here I did a little overview of, let's say, the core literature that informed our study. As you can see, there we looked at studies that either were focused on the type of entrepreneur or the industry context we are interested in. So like Josephy, that were looking at specifically at theater projects, or like Parankankas and Renko, the second study that was looking at, that was contrasting social to commercial entrepreneurs. The latter 2 articles are relevant for us because they use the same theory that we are using, which is the self-determination theory, but we will come back to this later on. Okay. So what for us was most important is that based on On our literature review, we found two prevailing research gaps. Firstly, the reward itself is central in reward crowdfunding and remains largely unexplored. Most studies look at campaign level data, look at, for example, persuasion or signaling theory or herding. Secondly, no study yet has contrasted backer motivation in different industry settings and reward crowdfunding. So if you look at the two latter examples from Ellison and Sholakova, they are not contrasting, they are looking specifically in the context of social entrepreneurship or in the case of Sholakova at commercial entrepreneurs in the reward crowdfunding context. Okay, with respect to the theoretical framework, based on those studies, for us it was conceivable that fundamental differences might also exist among backing motivations for culture and commercial ventures in reward crowdfunding. And to test this proposition, we apply self-determination theory, which is a theory from originating from psychology utilized for explaining how motivation affects behavior. In particular, the theory deals with how factors in our study, as I said, we look at rewards that are offered from entrepreneurs to compensate for the capital provided by the crowd, support or thwart the inherent psychological needs for competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And now I have to look at my notes because to properly define those terms. So the need for autonomy refers to feelings of volition and psychological freedom. The need for competence refers to the inherent urge of individuals to exert a meaningful effect on their surroundings, like to investigate and master their environment. And the need for relatedness refers to the experience of reciprocal care and concern for others. To illustrate the applicability of the theory, crowdfunding studies have already shown that in equity crowdfunding, investors are extrinsically motivated as they act to gain financial benefits for investing. On the other hand, pro-social lenders in the crowdfunding context have been found to be intrinsically motivated as they do not perform the act of giving to gain some separable outcome. Just look at, for example, the donation crowdfunding context where money is provided without any form of compensation, or at least any tangible form of compensation. In reward crowdfunding, rewards are often financial and non-pecuniary returns or an option to pre-order product or service. And based on SDT, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, we defined 3 reward types. First, symbolic rewards. Okay, you can see it here. Symbolic and experiential rewards are those that, in our estimation and based on the theory, count as intrinsically motivating rewards, and price discounts, by definition, are extrinsically motivating rewards. We chose experiential rewards because it relates very much to the psychological need of relatedness. So being part of a community, which has already been found in several studies. An example for this might be personal meetings with the founders and other non-business related social activities. Symbolic rewards, as I said, for us, we define it somewhat similar to the donation context to refer to rewards that don't have any tangible value to it. So this might be some affirmative gestures, thank you notes, this kind of stuff. Okay, I think that's for this one. So coming to our hypotheses, we defined 4 hypotheses. The first hypothesis and the second one reflect our extrinsic motivational rewards. So the reward crowdfunding is, as I said, in contrast to, for example, the donation crowdfunding context or the lending-based crowdfunding, the context of reward crowdfunding by definition is something like a pre-selling context. So it's used by businesses to pre-sell products or services prior to the official launching, irrespective of the sector of the business. So this is our baseline hypothesis, because we don't differentiate in this hypothesis between the different sectors. What, again, for both types of ventures, I think is important as well is that backers want to have their risks compensated, because previous studies have already shown, for example, in the Kickstarter domain, that many products are being delivered too late or never come to see the light of the market. So this was for us a reason to think that rewards involving a price discount have a significantly higher success rate than rewards without a price discount. For the second hypothesis, again, this is the first one where we try to contrast the cultural backers to commercial backers. Studies have consistently shown that backers of commercial projects in equity and reward crowdfunding settings are extrinsically motivated consumers that want to pre-order a service or product. However, I wish that I had a little bit more time to talk a little bit more about the cultural context, but previous studies, one of these core studies, have shown the importance of the community context, especially in the arts. So building on this, we put forward the idea that cultural backers represent various culturally oriented groups, such as art connoisseurs or collectors, enthusiasts or patrons, who value the cultural product highly and are generally more intrinsically motivated to provide financial aid. Thus, we posit hypothesis 2, which states that rewards involving a price discount are less relevant for motivating cultural backers than commercial backers. Okay. So hypothesis 3 and 4, as you can see, both relate to our intrinsic motivational measure. For hypothesis 3, in line with previous arguments, again, we expect that cultural backers will respond more positively to intrinsic rewards in general. Symbolic rewards are purely verbal offerings with no tangible value, like affirmative gestures, as I said. In such a scenario, cultural backers behave like altruistic, let's say, small patrons who support artists through financial donations. In order to see if we can find some similarities to the donation context. And this is why we came up with a hypothesis 3, which states that symbolic rewards are more relevant for motivating cultural backers and commercial backers. And sorry. For our last hypothesis, again, as I said, it relates to our to the need to feel related, and studies have consistently shown that it might be a part. It's like Scholakawa was not able to find intrinsic motivation in the context of technology ventures, but as I said, Parakankas and Renko, for example, show that this might indeed be an important motivation. So being part of a community or having a shared identity, and I think that this might. Okay, sorry, back. This might then lead to experiential rewards being more relevant for motivating cultural backers than commercial backers. Okay, so, but how did we test this? Okay, I indicated already that we use Start Next, which is the biggest or the largest rewards-based crowdfunding platform in Germany. We scraped all data that were, all project level data that were available, and had an interview with Start Next staff to discuss which categories we could use best for cultural campaigns as proxies for our cultural campaigns and for the commercial ones. So we ended up with a sample of arts and theater projects, which is in line with, for example, Throsby concentric circle framework, which represents like the core creative arts. And we contrast these two with technology and invention. So what we did then was that we, like other studies, we didn't go for all projects, but we limited it to to the last 6 years. 1 minute.
About a minute there, Tobias.
Oh my God. Okay, we ended up with 225 projects with 2,234 rewards. You can see our dependent variables here. We had 2 dependent variables, namely the number of backers in the reward and the amount pledged for reward. We had different dummy variables as our explanatory variables, like culture, price discount, symbolic, and experiential, and some control variables. You can see here we used Poisson regression. We categorized manually the rewards for our explanatory variables, and then use Poisson regression as it fits best with our data. What I need to raise here as well is that we also included random effects to also account for any heterogeneity of project quality. Here we can see some descriptive statistics with some high standard deviations. Okay. Maybe I will just go to table 3 and table 4 then, which relate to our hypothesis. And maybe we can discuss these. Yeah. Okay. Should I close my? Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. Luckily, we have time for questions and more discussion. If someone wants, you can even leave this slide up if you want, ask you to discuss the table or something. And if we get time at the end, we can come back at the end of the session and have more questions. Does anybody want to lead off with a question or some quick comments?
I got a quick question. Really interesting, Tobias. Given that we weren't able to go through all the in particulars of your results, if you had to pick one fact that you found or one finding from your study that you think has the most pull and is kind of the most important aspect of it, what would that be?
Yeah, for me it would be, and for Simon as well, the fact that for culture backers, the experiential rewards, so being part of a community, having a shared identity, some form of social activities are more important than for the commercial counterparts, especially when we look at the fact that likewise our price discount variable, which was part of our extrinsic motivational scale, was just raising, I think, both dependent variables for cultural backers by 20%, while in contrast for commercial backers, it was like raising the number of backers from about like 200% or something. It was doubling, and it just had minor effect on cultural backers. Again, contrasting this to the intrinsic measure. So we found that cultural backers are indeed very much different from commercial backers in this sense. And we hope to build a little bit more deeper, go more deeper into detail in this respect. Yeah.
Thanks. Another question. Anyone else want to? While we wait, so I'm glad you got a chance to summarize what you think was the big result. Great question, Jared. The question I have in a way is, if we think about this from the design standpoint, the entrepreneur goes onto the platform. If they were aware of effects of your findings, how would that inform how they would design their campaign? And so if you're not new solutions that were previously unknown, if someone knew all of this ahead of time, they not optimize this algorithm for maximizing pledges?
Yeah, I think, okay, you were like 2 seconds. I didn't hear like the last part of your question.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. In a way, what explains the negative residual? Would someone not optimize and choose things to maximize pledges? Why would they have something that was a bad idea in their design?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, like, I have the feeling that that most entrepreneurs are not really strategically designing the rewards itself. I think they more or less look at like similar categories and just look at what the other one is doing and more or less imitating what they find might be most appropriate to their own specific context. I mean, there might be some downturn to this, but I think, like, generally speaking, if you each and every contribution matters, right? So while we don't find, for example, that some symbolic rewards are significant in explaining our success measure, which was like to raise a number of backers or to raise the amount pledged, but I mean, like, money is money, and this might, especially in the reward crowdfunding context, what we oftentimes see is that projects are being just funded to their funding levels, right? And if they operate on the all or nothing principle, then they might just not overcome this hurdle. But there might be a downturn in just strategically designing, for example, cultural businesses just going for, okay, now that we know that they want to meet us and be part of community, now we can, especially for like, let's say we can raise the amount pledged significantly, then we just go with 5 of these. I don't think that this might actually will happen, but I think we see many things that are used like in every project that are not relevant for the success of the project in the end. So.
Okay, well, thank you. Appreciate the answer. Can you go back a slide to where you show your hypotheses? Ashley wanted to see what hypothesis 3 was, or what the 3 hypotheses were. And while you do that, I just want to give a quick plug because people are interested in this paper. There is a research brief for this paper, a short version of it, same with Jared's paper and mine, up on the workshop page.
Can you guys hear Doug?
Nope, he froze.
Okay.
And with that, sorry if I cut out. Perfect answer. Let's cut over to Jared now for our second presentation. Thank you very much, Tobias.
Thanks, Tobias. Good stuff. Let me share my screen. Right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Super excited to be presenting. I think anytime that you can look at the interaction between arts and creativity and entrepreneurship, it's a no-brainer, and it's a great thing. So I'm presenting a paper that myself and a couple colleagues, Regan Stevenson, who's up at Indiana, and Tang, Wang, who's with me at University of Central Florida, have written. And I, along with Tobias, I'm a PhD candidate. And this paper is looking at the role of intangible resources on pivoting decisions and pivoting speed. So one interesting thing when we look at creative workers, and in particular in the design space, is this issue with design fixation. And basically what occurs often is that when creative workers are trying to come up with solutions to present problems, they will oftentimes carry with them solutions that worked for them previously and try to apply them now. And sometimes it works, but oftentimes it doesn't work, especially if you think about creative processes, all the iterations and changes that are inherent in them. And so a lot of times they get kind of stuck and they get what's called design fixation. And so there's a really great paper by Kelley, 2017, that looks at this and talks about the importance of creative workers to be able to pivot or change direction when they hit these roadblocks. And when we look at the entrepreneurship and creative endeavors, building off that, entrepreneurship is often described as creativity in business. So much so that creativity researchers often investigate creative entrepreneurs' personality, motivation, cognition, things like this, to try to get a glimpse into what the creative process looks like. So there's this strong link between having to shift direction when you kind of hit roadblocks, and then also how that applies to creative workers in entrepreneurial contexts. And so specifically, when we look at creative entrepreneurs or creative workers in entrepreneurial contexts, they often are taking action under highly uncertain conditions where you can't really predict what the outcome of your decisions is going to be because it's uncertain. You don't know. You don't have a lot of past history to build off. And I'm sorry, hold on. Sorry. And as a result, oftentimes these creative entrepreneurs will hit sort of a roadblock as well, and need to make these quick, fast adjustments, either in strategy or to some aspect of their venture. So in essence, these individuals often have to change direction, or the sexy term right now is pivot, on some key aspect of their venture, and oftentimes in response to failure. And if you think about the idea of changing direction, it's almost by definition implies that something went wrong or something isn't working as well as you want to. And so it's really important to look at this phenomenon in the context of failure. Specifically, we define pivoting as a change in firm strategy, technology, product, or market that reorientates the firm's direction. So current research on pivoting is extremely scant. My dissertation is actually on pivoting, and it's doing a qualitative work as a result, but it's very scant. There's only 4 papers in quality journals that are looking at it. And the term pivoting actually derives from practitioners, and in particular, a guy, Eric Ries, I'm sure you're familiar with, wrote a book called The Lean Startup, and he conceptualizes entrepreneurship as this process of forming and testing business hypotheses. Importantly, he makes the distinction of saying, with very little or no tangible resources, instead relying on what he terms lean methods. We've all heard the lean startup method, and therefore having to really focus on intangible resource stock. So because in spite of this, there's a wide scale adoption of this idea of pivoting for practitioners. It's in every incubator and accelerator that you talk to. There isn't a lot of research on it, which makes it tough to build off, but it also makes it exciting because there's so many different areas that we can go into. And so because of the fact that entrepreneurship is in a lot of ways defined by having to make decisions in under conditions of resource scarcity, and the importance of pivoting, which speaks to the importance potentially of more intangible resources, we were really interested in looking at how do intangible resources influence pivoting decisions, and specifically for creative entrepreneurs. So we asked, how do intangible human, social, and psychological resources influence post-failure pivoting behavior and speed? Again, the failure aspect we felt is very important component to look at, and I'll get into it in a second, but we're also interested in looking at not just pivoting behavior, whether they choose to pivot, but also the speed in which they pivot. Again, I'll get to that in a second, actually right now. So we looked at a couple research streams to inform our research and to kind of make sure we were on the right track. One is the organizational change literature, and a couple things really popped for us there. One was that the pace of change is really important, which isn't being talked about right now necessarily in the pivoting literature. The pace of change in organizations is linked to a ton of really important outcomes, one of which is performance. And the other thing that popped is that the value and usefulness of resources is considered to be contingent on the context in which they're deployed, which was sort of validation for us, saying, given that intangible resources are so crucial for entrepreneurs, that let us know we were sort of on the right track. The other was the resource-based view. We're all familiar with this. This basically says that resources can be conceptualized, or firms can be conceptualized as bundles of resources and capabilities, and that these resources can be both tangible or intangible in nature, and they reflect or can be an indication of the strength or weakness of a firm. Also letting us know we were on the right track. There's a good amount of literature suggesting that the resource-based view is very important for entrepreneurship. And so entrepreneurship is a good context to look at intangible resources. So specifically, when we were looking at intangible resources, there's some good work looking at intangible resources, but it's more looking at firm performance. And the three that get looked at are intangible human resources, which are defined as the knowledge, skills, and abilities that individuals acquire through schooling, job experience, basically stuff you pick up if you're paying attention through life. Intangible social resources, which are defined as the assets or values that individuals extract from their social networks, in particular information that is acquired. And then intangible psychological resources, which this is really what we would consider psychological capital, which is a composite of hope, self-efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And it's important for understanding what shapes individuals' motivations, attitudes, behaviors, and in particular, how they deal with difficult situations such as failure. So when we look at intangible human resources, a couple important things. One, individuals with high levels of industry experience tend to understand the competitive nature of their environment. That's kind of a Captain Obvious moment. Of course they do. They have a lot of experience there, but it's important. These resources also, the previous knowledge that they gain through it can enhance entrepreneurs to respond to a variety of different circumstances, of which we believe that pivoting should be included. And that basically as decision makers increase their knowledge and competence, they're more willing to take risks, they're more confident in their decisions, and especially those associated with change processes, which we believed would influence both their decision to pivot. If you're more confident, you have more information related to the industry that you're in, you probably can make more informed decisions, but then also that it would enhance the speed of pivoting, that they would be able to pull the trigger faster, so to speak, and make decisions faster. When it comes to social resources, a lot of stuff here, but the main idea is a couple things. One, social resources have been shown to interact with human resources to such an extent that social resources are really, in a lot of ways, are only as useful as the people that are using them, right? So when we started to really think about what the role of social resources would be, we didn't feel comfortable with more of a direct effect. We thought that this would be something that would go hand in hand or interact with human resources. Decision makers in smaller entrepreneurial or creative organizations rely heavily on information derived from social resources, again, because they tend to work more from resource scarcity. And similar to human resources, social resources should strengthen the decision-making processes of creative workers because it's giving them more information to build off of. And so we expected that these intangible social resources, namely information derived from social resources, would strengthen the positive relationship between intangible human resources and both whether or not they pivot and also the speed of pivoting. When it comes to the role of psychological resources, again, this psych cap really helps individuals deal with difficult situations. It helps to hedge against, we've all probably heard the term learned helplessness. It's when you go through difficulties and you feel like there's nothing I can do about it, I'm just kind of stuck. Psych cap really helps to hedge against that. And importantly, it helps to influence an individual's ability to positively deal with organizational change, but not necessarily induce organizational change. So similar to social resources, we didn't think this was necessarily going to be a direct effect. But individuals who are high in psych cap, in other words, they might have the internal resources, kind of the internal strength to deal with change, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the knowledge and skills to enact change. So we expected that there was going to be a three-way interaction between intangible psychological, human, and social resources on, again, both the decision to pivot as well as pivoting speed. For our sample, we looked at almost 1,600 Kickstarter projects between 2011 and 2013. Each project was produced by a creative entrepreneur seeking funding for a book that they're publishing. If you think about the process of writing a book, it is inherently creative. And so we thought it gave us a good sampling frame for our study. And importantly, we only looked at projects that failed. We then, in order to operationalize pivoting, we collected data from Amazon. And so our pivot operationalization is really a market platform pivot. And so we looked at whether or not these individuals pivoted to Amazon. So we collected data from Amazon as well. Pivot direction, I just described it, moving from Amazon to Kickstarter. These are dependent variables. And then the time it took them to make that pivot is in the number of months between when they failed on Kickstarter and when they appeared on Amazon. For our independent variables, human capital was a dummy variable measuring whether or not the entrepreneurs had previously created any campaigns on Kickstarter. This gets at the knowledge and experience side of human capital. For social capital, dummy variable looking at whether or not the entrepreneurs received feedback from backers. Tobias did a really good job of explaining what a backer is. But basically, there's a section on Kickstarter where anybody who has invested in the project can provide information on what they think about it. So it's a really good source of social information. And then psychological capital, we used a validated CATA dictionary to measure psych cap within the campaign section of Kickstarter. The campaign section is the area where the entrepreneur can get on there and talk about what they think about life and how they're going to deal with challenges. And it's a good platform to get at their psychological states. For measures, we looked at gender, that's been shown to be important, and then important project level controls, as well as, because we were looking at individual characteristics, in particular psych cap, we thought it was important to look at personality constructs as well, and these are all based on CATA dictionaries as well. For methods, we ran two different analyses. One was just a straight logistic regression, basically to look at the A side, whether or not they pivoted. But then the B side, because it has to do with time, amongst other things, we wanted to account for the potential of right-censored data. And so we ran a Cox survival analysis. Results, everything turned out except for hypothesis 3A, which counterintuitively, we're still wrapping our heads around it. The coefficient was negative, suggesting that the higher someone's psychological capital, the less likely they are to pivot. And if they do pivot, the longer it takes them to pivot. So very interested in what your thoughts might be on that. We got one. Discussion, so for contributions, we believe we make a good contribution to the literature on the resource-based view by considering the role of intangible resources at more of a micro level and providing a good, strong link between RBV and entrepreneurship. Also, we extend research looking at the antecedents of entrepreneurial pivoting by theorizing how these intangible resources influence whether entrepreneurs decide to pivot and the speed of pivoting, which we believe is the third one. And I am most excited about this. As part of my dissertation, I'm trying to differentiate pivoting from strategic change and strategic orientation and business model innovation. And one of the things that you find when you look at these different areas of research is that strategic, when you look at change in general, they differentiate between different types of change. So there's revolutionary change and discontinuous change and continuous change. And and they found important implications of that. And so I think a really strong contribution of ours is, this is the first paper that I'm aware of that starts to really get at the nuance of different aspects of pivoting by looking at the speed and the direction. So for future research, again, hypothesis 3, our thought is that this might be a proxy for overconfidence, such that individuals with really high levels of psych cap might not take much stock in information derived from social resources and maybe information derived from their own experience. And so it's having its effect on pivot processes. We did not account for other platforms that these entrepreneurs might have pivoted to. They could have pivoted to other crowdfunding sites such as Indiegogo, places like this. So that would be an important area for future research. I think there's also room to investigate other sources of social and human capital. So looking at social media, do these entrepreneurs post their projects on there as a way to promote it? My guess is they do. Human capital, do other experiences and skills and knowledge that these entrepreneurs have, or is it influencing this process as well? And then obviously external validation stuff. Definitely this can be extended to other entrepreneurial samples. And that's all I have to say about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Well done. Let's throw this open to some questions. Who out there would like to ask? Virtually raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'm surprised we haven't seen any jumping at this. No. Well, I can tell you from my perspective, I'm glad to see that you put this sort of multi-homing issue up there. I think we aren't doing, the literature is really underdeveloped in terms of the creators' decisions about where to launch their campaign, on which platform, and the idea of being able to launch on multiple platforms, and the choice among that is something that I don't think we've explored much. And it may not be your particular interest, right? But it still could affect what you observe as people drop in and out of sample because of it.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. How about somebody fake a question? Just think of something that
you've left them speechless. So you're only, I'll keep going. Oh, we've got something in the chat room here. All right, Tobias has a question. Please go.
Thank you. I mean, like, I was thinking about like pivot in the context that I've heard it used in the like very practical sense from our incubator, was like really more of a small change. So what you are describing here, pivoting from funding from Kickstarter to Amazon might be like a little bit too big of a stretch, right? But I mean, like, I don't know if it's possible to maybe see for those cases who did this change to look at like some more incremental change and more incremental pivoting. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. I don't think if it's possible in the sense of creative workers in the books and the publishing industry. If or you could do like a post-hoc survey maybe or in-depth interviews maybe to get more qualitative insights maybe.
Yeah, you're in good company. This is the #1 pushback we get on this paper. When we originally started writing it, we were really building off Rice. He has a taxonomy of different pivots, and one of them is a market platform pivot. And he talks about product pivots, and he talks about all these nuanced different types of pivots. I'm really deep into my dissertation on this topic, and I have almost different opinions on if we're going to differentiate a pivot from these other change-related constructs. I don't know if I would consider this a pivot anymore either. So you're in good company. Some scholars are still going to consider it a pivot. I have some friends that are working in areas like this, and they'll describe a change in product as a pivot. So I think that's a very, very valid concern, and we hear it quite a bit. So it's good thought.
Thanks. Let's try to sneak in one last quick question from Shoshana Goldberg-Miller.
Thank you so much, Doug. So what I wanted to say is thank you for your presentation. Then the idea of pivoting away from something could also be thought of as moving towards something. And so that would be thinking about it as opportunity spotting. And my colleague Margaret Wismirsky has written about that, opportunity spotting. So, what they're doing is saying no to something, but they're looking for other options. So that might be some literature that you might want to take a look at.
Yeah, I appreciate it. The other thing that I'm uncovering during the dissertation process is right now pivoting is really operationalized in terms of something went bad, and so you have to now pivot. However, I think it's possible. In fact, I was an entrepreneur for a little over 10 years, and I did this. It's also possible that things are going okay, but you see a better opportunity, and so you pivot over to that. And so there's obviously costs and benefits that come with that. But yeah, great insight. I think that's definitely a whole other research stream that can open up when it comes to pivoting is, what are you pivoting toward? Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Margaret Wozimirski has some really great writing on that.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank
Sure.
you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you, Jared. I guess it's my turn on the clock now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to see if I can figure out how to share screen and be part of all this. With luck and with time at the end, we will be able to come back with questions for the other projects. And we'll see if I can speed through this. If for some reason my internet connection gets dicey, I'm going to ask Tobias to raise his hand and flail because he's the one that's still showing up on my screen. All right, so thank you. And I'm glad the last presentation talked a bit about failure because first, I don't think we talk about it enough. And second, because I've got some findings here that relate to it. So in my paper about mobility among arts-related crowdfunders, goal here is to identify the drivers of relocation decisions by artists and others who are on a crowdfunding platform. So this is physical relocation or changing art. And we're going to be using this Kickstarter platform again, using all the products we could find that'll be relevant. I'll describe that in a minute, across 900 or more different metropolitan, micropolitan areas around the US. I need to say thank you to the NEA for helping to support this, and also mention that all of the ideas presented here are mine and not theirs. I also want to say thanks to a shirt grant out of the University of Toronto that supported this, and some support from Virginia Tech. The big contributions we have here are first to examine mobility among crowdfunding entrepreneurs. I don't think anyone's looked at this aspect of crowdfunding before. We want to show the importance of geography, even for those who are doing their impact in the cloud or on a platform. We want to look at the importance of clustering, especially by different categories or types of creative activity. Well, to preview the findings here, it turns out local matters a lot, even when you're living in the cloud. These entrepreneurs, turns out, aren't very footloose. They don't move much, and when they do move, they tend to move very locally. Interestingly, whether they succeed or fail in their initial campaign has significant impact over their later choices about relocation and where to relocate. We also show that creators are drawn to well-developed crowdfunding communities that are relevant to them, not just crowdfunding in general, but musicians are drawn to crowdfunding musicians. Musicians are drawn to crowdfunding musicians, and theater people are drawn to theater people. General conditions, like overall wealth or education levels, don't matter much. To give you a quick bit of background and mobility, you can see this in the full paper. We are building off the high-skilled worker mobility literature, which is fairly large, and it mostly emphasizes how people move for career opportunities. People move for jobs. There's an urban wage premium that accrues to productivity spillovers and learning spillovers. Both of those would suggest people will tend to cluster and move to other people they can get the externality from. And thicker markets suggests that these people will move to places where they can find better matches. That may be even more important as they try to seek out a crowd, given that they're looking for crowdfunding. The literature on artist mobility emphasizes things like being more mobile, that certain cities specialize in different art forms, and social networks mattering a lot. It's not a good sign that my internet is cutting out, but I appreciate Tobias waving at me. Oh, I'm totally frozen now. All right.
It might help, Doug, to turn your video off.
Yeah, try that. You don't see me. All right. Thank you, Jared. So one other aspect of this is the prior experience piece, where we're looking at repeat crowdfunders, or people who have done this multiple times. So we want to look at their past experience, much like Jared did. And we have a feeling that past experience helps people build backer networks and build capital, and possibly learn that they're not in the right place to do their project. They need to move. So One other bit for those who aren't familiar with it, Kickstarter is arguably the world's largest platform based crowdfunding, over $5 billion raised and millions of backers. By now, it looks like about a quarter of Americans have contributed on one of these crowdfunding platforms at this point. It's surprisingly not niche anymore. To give you a sense of empirical work we're doing, we start with scraping all the Kickstarter data from 2009 to 2016. So that's about 250,000 projects. We have a lot of information about the creators of these projects. We have their ID and their name. We don't know, their age or where they went to school, but we do know their name, which we'll come back to. We take all this Kickstarter activity and we map it down to the metropolitan and micropolitan area level. So we have about 930 of these regions around the US, covering the great majority of the population of the US. And we now have measures then for these regions, their aggregate measures of the dollars raised in Kickstarter activity, or the amount of backers for Kickstarter activity in that region, the amount of projects. And we measure these predominantly in rank terms to try to keep things correct, because we're also going to out all of the categories. There's about 14 different Kickstarter categories. So we can measure whether a city is high ranked in terms of art, in terms of music, in terms of theater, or publishing, or what have you. So we have separate ranks for each of them. Next is the fun part. We take the 250,000 of projects and we pull out all the projects done by creators who appear multiple times in this database. There's about 25,000 that we'll refer to as repeat creators. So we know the location of their first project and the location of their second project. So we can look to see if those locations change between projects. They've relocated. And so about 6,000 of these creators have relocated between projects. And we also bring in a bunch of other descriptor variables, control variables at the CBSA level, looking at employment mix, climate, and other demographics. So we're doing two models here. First is this first stage of decision. You're one of these 25,000 repeat creators, looking at it from you just finished your first project. Should you stay or should you go before your next project? This is just going to be a basic logit model predicting whether you stay or go. Next, we do a conditional logit for the 6,000 who choose to go. We're going to know where they go among all the possible choices of other CBSAs, of other regions around the US. Where are they going to go? So this is all based on a random utility framework akin to recreational choice models or transportation mode models. Here we have to define what our alternatives in the choice set are, and we pick the CBSA, these 900 major regions in the US. We think that's the most relevant scale for differentiating Seattle from New York, from more or something like that. But it also fits nicely because we have a choice set issue with 6,000 movers and 900 possible destinations. We're looking at millions of observations and a problem for maximum likelihood estimation. So given the huge choice set, we take a common approach here, which is to randomly sample among the 9 destinations each of the papers. So each of them get a random draw of 10 CBSAs, plus the 11th is the one they actually did choose. So then we do a conditional logit across those 11 choices to predict what factors explain why they picked the one they picked and go to the other ones. And we're going to estimate both of these models based on a simple set of covariates, population, demographics, employment mix, and a bundle of many variables, mostly climate and geographic ones. And then a set of these Kickstarter activity variables, how much Kickstarter activity is in that area. The logit models, the should I stay or should I go models, are based on the origin cities variables. So it's the origin, your home cities, amenity mix, your home cities employment mix. And then the conditional logit, the destination choice model, is based on the destination attributes because we can't identify off the origin attributes because, of course, those don't vary based on the decision maker, and we essentially have mover level fixed effects. All right, To give you a quick sense of the descriptors, I won't go through this, but the left-hand side is 25,000 repeat creators, 23% of which are people who end up moving. And then over on the right, you can see among those who move, 49% of them actually moved within the CSA, locally, essentially. They moved in their metro area. So only half of these movers actually go in a long distance move, which is not atypical of migration patterns generally. These footloose creative entrepreneurs aren't terribly mobile. You can see how film and music are the two most popular categories in Kickstarter, and they're also the two most popular categories among these repeat creators. The average project brings in less than $10. Should I stay or should I go? The question of who goes, well, people who leave, who tend to leave, are the ones who start in bigger cities. They also tend to be the ones who start in the Northeast or New England. They tend to move westward. Who goes? The people who tend to start in cities who have fewer projects, fewer Kickstarter projects in their category. And the people who tend to leave are those who start in cities that have low success rates on average among projects in their category. Who go? Those are the ones who tend to start off with a failed campaign. If your first campaign failed, you're more likely to have your second campaign appear in a different city. And the people who are more likely to go are those who ended up raising more money on their initial campaign. So I guess they can afford a plane ticket at that point. It's interesting to see that failures, the ones whose initial project fails, they're much more likely to stay, not go, if their initial failed project attracts more backers. But the number of backers on the initial project doesn't affect the successful project's decisions to stay or go. So the successful ones aren't sort of encumbered or beholden to their local backer network. They feel that they can end up leaving. Successes are even more prone to these effects of own Kickstarter activity, the ones in their own project in town. They're much more sensitive to those, and they're likely to leave their weak market. There are some differences by genre, category of arts, performance-related categories, music, those are more likely to move, all else equal, and more digital categories tend to move even more often if they're one of the few people doing Kickstarter projects of that type in the metro area. To me, the more interesting question ends up being where do they go question, who did leave. And we see the first biggest thing that explains where to go is the distance to the destination. People tend to pick things that are really close by. But even once we control for that, they tend to move towards bigger markets, bigger population areas. They move westward, and they tend to be moving to areas that have more projects of their own type and higher success rates in projects of their own type. They aren't very much about overall Kickstarter activity and destinations. They care about the Kickstarter specifically in their genre. And all of these creators tend to move to have more creative class in that area. Interestingly, we found generally insignificant here the effects of education levels in the area. Climate, amenity variables didn't matter. Employment, even in job employment sectors related to their own category, this was generally insignificant. And if anything, income was negatively related to the likelihood of choosing it, perhaps because they can't afford those higher rent cities. There were some differences by the category of artists. Musicians drawn to better weather, musicians were, not sure why. And interestingly, among all the subcategories of these Kickstarter creators, it was really only the music projects that are drawn to employment in the music sector. So there was a big draw to Nashville, there's a draw to Seattle. No one else in the other sector seemed to care much, even in film and video. They weren't drawn to places that have high film and video content. The arts and film video categories tended to ignore destinations that had high intensity of Kickstarter activity in their own area. So while artists or musicians might have been drawn to places that had more Kickstarting musicians there, film and video were not particularly drawn to places that were popular among other film and video Kickstarters. So keeping big breaks here, Geography matters, even those in platforms. Failures tend to move more, but the successful ones tend to be able to range more widely in where they go. They tend to suffer fewer of those constraints. The niche workers were drawn, these niche creators drawn to people in their niche. Market size mattered a lot more than amenities, so they were chasing crowds, which makes some sense, especially given that many crowds in the crowdfunding context have a very nice component. They don't all just get scattered around the world. The employment mix did matter, but it wasn't simply employment in related jobs. And heterogeneity across artist types mattered a great deal. Controlling for own type of Kickstarter activity or own type of employment mattered a lot. And we have to leave it for future work to actually get into more information about these individual creators as possible explanatory factors about why they're moving and where they're going. We simply don't have that data, but at least looking at those who move multiple times, we do get a chance to see where they go and see how it relates to some of these other factors. I'll try to turn my video on. Hopefully I've got some connectivity, and hopefully you guys got to see at least some of that presentation. All right, let me look at the categories. If someone wants to jump in and raise their hand, I'll try to call on them, but I'm reading through the chats right now. My audience was garbled. Oy. Well, I was getting good tech advice, but useless while I was in the middle. How bad was it? All right. Well, I've got some time. I can explain anything that was particularly or especially garbled. I will try to explain it again if someone wants to tell me which part that was. Jared, go.
So are we able to track where the backers come from? Like where backers are located? I don't know how that works.
That's a great question. We are not able to do it. Kickstarter knows where they are. They've got their credit card. So they've got all they've got their credit card information. They know exactly where they are. And there's no way on this earth that Kickstarter is sharing that information. So short running survey of the backers for a particular project, or getting access to a particular campaign's mailing list. You know, if they have to mail out their product, if they have to mail out those books once it's done, they know where these backers are. But short of having access to that stuff, there's no way we're going to get administrative data on all these backers' locations.
Yeah, because if they did give credit card numbers, I'd rather have that than their location.
Yeah, right. Good point. Any other questions or especially requests for clarification? Monica.
I'm just overall curious about the motivation or what you're thinking you might find in relationships between moving and running Kickstarter campaigns. In my mind, there is not really a direct relationship or a reasoning why it's important.
Well, so the motivation for this in some ways is basically try to better understand entrepreneurial mobility as we try to look to see where entrepreneurs are going. And part of that's an interesting question because we're interested in entrepreneurs in themselves, but also it's interesting because many cities are competing to try to get these entrepreneurs to move there. And that's actually the paper I do in the next panel in B5. I'll talk a bit more about it from the city's perspective. That said, I think there's a bigger question on some of these things about what is really the connection between being an entrepreneur, being on Kickstarter, and moving. And for many of these people, I think we expected that many of them aren't moving because, oh, their first Kickstarter campaign in Chicago didn't work. So they thought, I better go to Miami because that'll fix everything. And they moved their whole life to Miami and do another Kickstarter. I think none of us really expect that is going to show up much in the data. We think that in most cases, these are probably moonlighting or side hustles or gigs that people are doing. And they or a significant other has a real job that has a stable, less risky source of income. And they might have been moved for, it was a corporate relocation. They're stuck in Denver now. And the Kickstarter showed up as they moved, having nothing to do really with Kickstarter whatsoever. And so while we expect that's probably the dominant part of the data, under that hypothesis, we probably expect almost all of the Kickstarter-related variables to be statistically insignificant, but they won't matter because people are moving in ways that are completely unrelated to Kickstarter. Kickstarter has nothing to do with these relocations. But one thing we see is there is a really strong pull between a metro area's strength in Kickstarter in a particular category and the likelihood that a Kickstarter chooses to relocate there after their first project. And we see a strong likelihood of they're more likely to move if your first Kickstarter project fails. Those probably wouldn't happen if you're just tagging along from a corporate relocation, or you're the second mover in a two-body problem. If you're the trailing spouse, we wouldn't expect to see much of this. So I think we're, if anything, a little surprised to see such significant results show up. Okay, so I got a question from Jian Fang, who I probably butchered your name, out at UC Riverside, about how we define move. So the move in this case is simply we have the same creator in the Kickstarter database who appears multiple times in sequence. And a move is if the location they list for their first project is different than in the second. So it's also possible that someone moves multiple times here. They start in Chicago, they go to Atlanta, and then they go to LA. And so they could appear multiple times here if they move around the country. I think one of the results that's consistent, one of the stories here is that we see the performance arts are more likely to show that they move between projects. And I think that could be the case, that it's not that you've relocated to Atlanta, it's that you're raising money for an exhibit in Atlanta, or a show in Atlanta, or a special event. It's not that you've actually uprooted your family or your permanent address and moved there. And so I think one of the things we're picking up is that some of these performing artists are touring more than moving. And I think that's an important distinction there, which is why it's interesting to take them out and look at some of the other types of creators who are less prone to touring, as it were.
You might also see that as a performing artist, you're adding your team. So if they get more successful, they will have a manager or some other team member somewhere else. And I think that's what you might be seeing too.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you, another thing we found when we look at this data and play with the geography of it, some of the locations, which are all self-reported locations by the creator, these aren't, actual tax return mailing addresses or something like that. People may be spoofing their location. I wouldn't list my small suburb of Indianapolis when launching a project. I would pick Indianapolis, or I certainly wouldn't pick a suburb of Nashville for my music launch. I might pick the main locations, which is one reason why we threw everyone into the same metro area instead of trying to differentiate across those things. But the idea that you would spoof your address, and you could say you're anywhere, might make people look a little more mobile than they really are. All right, but enough about me. We've got a couple minutes left in this session, and let's make sure we throw it open to questions for everybody. And while I wait for the question to raise hands, I will notice it looks like both Bronwyn and Tobias asked about the time between moves. So great minds must think alike. We have that. Well, the problem is we don't know when they move. They could have moved right after failure and then waited 5 years for their next Kickstarter, or they could have failed or succeeded, waited 5 years, moved, and then did a Kickstarter the next day. We don't really know. But still, the time between projects would probably be relevant, and we haven't used it. We haven't looked at it. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you. Other questions for anyone else here? Anyone? Yeah, Monica, go ahead.
I mean, I asked you earlier and you responded to some about the trends on Kickstarter that you see. It seems, to me that there's a downward spiral in terms of cultural or arts project being on Kickstarter and being funded. So any input there?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Are you thinking about this downward trend just in 2020 or?
No, over the last years. I mean, my impression is that it's gotten way less popular to do these crowdfunding campaigns.
Well, yes, my understanding is it's basically plateaued. The really rapid growth of Kickstarter about 3 or 4 years ago started to very much flatten out. And I think you're seeing evolution in it's changing who is doing them now. But also I think we're seeing the rise of other platforms. And so people can go towards other places as well. So that's sort of eroding the market power, the concentration that Kickstarter has. And actually I'm going to point the finger over to Tal to let you weigh in on the trends we've seen in 2020. Because I know you were just pulling up these graphs on the 2020 figures. And I think there's some interesting trends there as well.
Yes, I mean, quite understandably, I mean, we've seen that since the pandemic, we've seen like Doug said, after a long plateau or some, it's not really a plateau. I mean, there's really interesting trends related to month of year. Like in December, there's usually much more project launched, and then just in the beginning of the year, there's usually a down trend in the new project. But we've seen really an exceptional downtrend since end of February and March, with a recovery in the last weeks, in the last month or so. But it really, the locality is so interesting because Doug, you are of course concentrated on people in the US moving from place to place. But it would be also, because you should know that Kickstarter, like around 70% of the number of, I mean, there are also projects from outside of the US, which are around 70% of the number of US projects. And it would be really interesting maybe to think, to see if there were some international moves that can maybe also give us some idea about what Doug, you called spoofing of locality, because I mean, if we see a lot of moving from foreign countries to USA, it could be really maybe an indicator for people just mentioning the US because they're thinking they will have better chances of getting funded if they are in the US.
Yeah, one of the trends we've been seeing over time is an increasing share of the projects being international. And some of that is a change in international law and regulations overseas. And some of that is probably a genuine shift. But it's interesting, mid-pandemic, US projects actually became a minority of overall Kickstarter projects temporarily because the US bottomed out faster than the rest of the world. Shoshana.
Thank you. Okay, so this question is a bit broader, and that has to do with the word crowdfunding and the concept, which I think now Gen Z thinks that's funding. And so my question is, kind of scrolling back to this idea that these people feel that they're funding something when really they're giving money, but they're not really donating. It's not a nonprofit. So can you speak to kind of the shift in this, this phenomenon where they're not donors and they're not venture capitalists because they're not ever going to get anything back, really, Can you speak to how, the context of this phenomenon?
I think it's a great question. And for those of you who watched the panels, yesterday morning's panel with John Leland from Kickstarter on there, really made this interesting point about how crowdfunding is a very small piece of this huge gap between venture capital and charitable donations. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of empty space there, and this is a small slice, but it's totally in the middle. So I want to let Tobias and Jared try that.
So admittedly, most of my research isn't in the crowdfunding space. But from my understanding, a lot of the backers, while this isn't the principal reason why they do it, they will get some sort of version of the product, whether it's like an MVP, like it's just a initial version of the product, or like in our cases, we went through and actually looked at a lot of the comments in the campaigns, and the creators were sending out versions of their book for those who backed the project. And so I agree with Doug. It seems like it's this middle ground where people, there's obviously a level of benevolence and people want to feel like they're contributing to these struggling entrepreneurs who can't raise money, this and that. But there might also be some self-interest in that. A lot of them will explicitly post on their Kickstarter campaign, you know, if you donate X amount of money, you get these sort of rewards in return. So it does seem to be like this kind of middle ground.
Really, there's not much to add, but maybe two, at least anecdotal evidence I got from attending different conferences and pitching at least the idea in the last year of the paper was that from professionals working with for example, musicians, new music companies, for example, or self-employed musicians, for example, they were really reluctant to use the reward crowdfunding at all, right? And because it was like giving up the sense of self, of artistic self, right? It didn't fit into the self-perception as an independent artist. And like Patreon, for example, or other crowdfunding forms where they might be more independently working on the stuff that's important for them without giving up on their initial idea. So and maybe when it comes to technology, I think it's completely right that for more commercially oriented businesses, it's more like building an MVP in the very, very early stages that businesses come to or use reward crowdfunding to see if the MVP is able to convince backers and more for more marketing purposes, right? And for showing investors that there might be something interesting here.
Great. Thank you. I like that answer. All right, we're over on time. Next session starts in 13 minutes. Let's all take a break. But before we do that, as Shoshana said, let's give a big thank you to the speakers, especially Tobias and Jared. Well done. Fascinating session. I enjoyed it and learned a ton from it. We'll see you guys for the fourth panel. And this is a reminder, there's sort of panel A4 is room A and A5 is actually in room B, just to make it really confusing. But look at the program, pick the left or right column. It's either A or B. We should have a slide up when you get there saying which papers are going to be in which room. And it's a supersized session with 4 papers in each of these, as opposed to just 3. So buckle up and thank you all.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks.